Hello there! In Acts chapter 8, the Apostle Philip tells the good news of Jesus Christ to an Ethiopian eunuch. The man joyfully accepted baptism from Philip and brought his new faith back to the Ethiopian court. He thereby began the legacy of African Christianity that continues to this day, a vibrant and growing family of faith with ancient roots and fascinating history. Although the Bible does not name this man, tradition gives his name as Simeon Bakos. Join us as we explore the world of ancient African Christianity that he originated. Join us as we follow along in Simeon's way. Episode 4, When Israel Went Back to Egypt, the Jews of Africa. The story of early Christianity is inseparable from the story of Judaism. Christians followed a Jewish Messiah. Many of them were Jews themselves. And all Christians believed that the God of Jesus Christ was the same God who brought Israel out of Egypt. But by the time of Christianity, many Jews had returned to Egypt or elsewhere on the African continent. Understanding their relationship to Africa is crucial to our story. Now, the relationship between Jews and Africa goes back to the Old Testament itself and the Exodus narrative. You may recall the story from such venerated documents as the Book of Genesis, the Book of Exodus, Andrew Lloyd Webber's hit disco-inspired musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, or the animated classic movie The Prince of Egypt. Jacob, also called Israel, has 12 sons, including his favorite son Joseph, who is in the annoying habit of having dreams predicting his superiority to his brothers and telling them all about it. The brothers sell Joseph into slavery as retaliation for his dreams, and the poor boy is taken to Egypt. While in Egypt, he rises through the ranks to become the vizier and protects the country from a massive famine that affects the entire region. In fact, it's so massive that it also affects his brothers up in Israel. So the brothers head down to Egypt to get relief and find their long-lost brother in power. They begin to worry that they may have made a mistake with the whole selling him into slavery thing, but Joseph forgets them and invites them to settle with him in Egypt. There the Israelites stay for 400 years, during which time the Egyptians become paranoid about the foreign Israelites and enslave them. God sees the misery of the Israelites and sends Moses to free them and bring them back to the land of Canaan. The reigning Pharaoh is less than stoked to lose his free workforce and refuses to let them go, at which point Moses unleashes 10 divine plagues while singing a really killer duet with Pharaoh that speaks of his heartbreak at the pain he inflicts on his brother and on his people alongside his desire for justice. Okay, that last bit is just in The Prince of Egypt, but it's really good. Anyway, Pharaoh eventually does let the Israelites go, which begins their long journey to Canaan and the formation of ancient Judaism as we know it. Now, the biblical narrative raises an important question among historians, namely, how much of this stuff actually happened? Outside of the Bible, there is no mention of anything resembling the story that we find in Genesis and Exodus. And many scholars are hesitant to trust the biblical account, which was written down hundreds of years after the events in question, and which was written by the Israelites, of course, who were maybe not unbiased observers of the situation. Now, if you believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God, then maybe that settles the question for you. The Bible said it, so it happened, and that's that. I am a Christian priest, and while I could give you a punishingly intricate lecture on what exactly it means for the Bible to be inspired, I do happen to think that the Exodus narrative occurred more or less as the Bible records it. But it is one thing to believe that as a matter of religious faith. It is another thing to say that we can prove that it happened as a matter of history, in the same way we can prove that World War II happened, or that Napoleon really existed. So here is the state of the historical evidence. As I said, there is no evidence outside of the Bible for a massive migration of Israelites from Egypt. However, the Exodus happened over 3,000 years ago. We don't have much evidence of anything for that time. Now, the Egyptians were kind enough to write down a lot of their records on big stone pillars, and big stone pillars are pretty good at surviving, even for 3 millennia. That's one of the reasons why we know a lot more about ancient Egypt than we do about most other ancient cultures. Some scholars find it odd that there are no Egyptian records of the Exodus story. My personal historical opinion is this: if you can't imagine why a monarch with absolute power, whose power was based on the belief that he was the son of a god and was virtually invincible, might not want to record a story about getting his hiney handed to him by the god of a slave race he viewed as inferior, then I have a bridge to sell you. Furthermore, while, as I said, there is no direct evidence for the Exodus, there is some circumstantial evidence in favor of it. We do have records of Egyptian pharaohs engaging in conflict with a group of Middle Eastern raiders called the Hyksos. The Hyksos may have been an Egyptian name for early Israelite tribes, or the Hyksos may have been a Canaanite group active while the Israelites were in Egypt. It's possible that the Egyptians began to look at their Jewish neighbors with suspicion as they came into conflict with the Hyksos who lived in the Jews' ancestral lands. The same thing happened in the United States in World War II. Those with German and Japanese heritage were under heavy suspicion, even those whose families had lived in the United States for generations. Japanese citizens were rounded up and kept in work camps in the United States for the duration of the war. And those with Arab ancestry in the United States even today know this sad story of prejudice is still a very current one in the days after September 11th, 2001. So it's not at all improbable that the Egyptians might have enslaved the Israelites to prevent an uprising, or just because they were worried about the Hyksos having allies on the inside. And that is exactly what the Bible says the Egyptians did. We do know that pharaohs definitely used forced labor for their building projects, so that part of the biblical story checks out. Furthermore, scholars have pointed out that even if an historian can't just take the Bible at its word unquestioningly, they should still consider the evidence that an entire race of people built their communal identity around a story about coming out of Egypt. You see, the Exodus isn't just one story in ancient Judaism, it is the story. The Exodus is the moment at which the children of Abraham become a nation. It's when they receive the law from God at Mount Sinai. It is the promise of God's faithfulness in the face of oppression and terror par excellence. The Old Testament scholar John J. Collins, who is skeptical of the historicity of a lot of the Bible, says that it is inconceivable that a story like the Exodus would have developed if some Jews hadn't come out of Egypt at some point. I've met John Collins, by the way. He taught at my seminary. He's a super nice guy, and he is Irish, so he teaches with this wonderful lilting Irish accent that I cannot possibly imitate, so I'm not going to try. I really wanted to take Old Testament with him just so I could listen to that melodic voice. I didn't get to. Instead, I got Bob Wilson, who was a Disciples of Christ preacher, and he looked like if Vizzini from The Princess Bride had survived his poisoning from the dread Pirate Roberts, got a PhD in Old Testament, and taught for 50 years. Man, there were a lot of characters in my Old Testament department. Good times. Anyway, where were we? Oh yeah, the Exodus. Okay, now, some of the criticisms of the biblical account have more to do with the details than the general shape of the story. For example, the book of Exodus says that 600,000 Israelite men left Egypt and went into the desert with Moses. So if we include not just the men, but the women and children too, then we probably are talking about 2 million Israelites wandering through the desert. Now that is the kind of migration that should leave some sort of archaeological record even 3 millennia later. There is none. Nor is there much evidence of a big old Israelite migration into Canaan around the time the Exodus would have happened. Remember the city of Jericho, the one that fell down when the Israelites blew their trumpets? Yeah, the best evidence is that there was no city of Jericho at the time. It just didn't exist. It was not inhabited. So what do we make of this? There's some circumstantial evidence for the Exodus, and there are some details of the story that are very, very hard to justify. The decision, of course, is ultimately yours to make.
but since this is my podcast, I will tell you my personal opinion. I am not a trained historian, but I have studied with a number of historians and biblical scholars. I think what is being missed by these analyses is that much of the content of the Bible is deeply symbolic. So, for example, when Exodus says that 600,000 men came out of Egypt, I notice that the number 6 is deeply symbolic in the Jewish scriptures. There are 6 days of creation. And the Exodus narrative is structured very similarly to the creation narrative of Genesis. So it might be that the figure of 600,000 was chosen by the author to make a theological point. Just as God created the earth in 6 days, so God created the people of Israel through the Exodus. It's not an historical fact, and it wasn't meant to be. It's meant to convey allegorical truth about the perfection of God's work in the Exodus. Now, the conquest of Canaan is a whole nother can of worms, and we'll talk about it in a future episode, but suffice it to say that I think there are symbolic truths behind the story of Jericho as well. So, where does that leave us in this church history podcast? Well, I will leave the matters of faith and biblical inspiration up to you and your tradition. I've already given you my 2 cents as a priest and as someone familiar with the historical arguments. Historically, I think what we can say is that there was some kind of interaction between Jews and Egyptians, wherein a number of Jews had a bad time in Egypt and left for Canaan. Beyond that, there isn't enough to say more, but even that shows a connection between Jews and the African continent. And that connection was only just beginning. You see, the ancient connections between Jews and Africans are not just biblical. They are linguistic. Ancient Hebrew belongs to a class of languages known as the Afro-Asiatic family. I know Afro-Asiatic sounds like the name of some kind of hipster fusion cuisine restaurant, but it's not. It's actually a group of about 400 different languages that scholars have determined likely share a common point of origin. The Afro-Asiatic family includes the Berber languages, Ancient Egyptian, also called Coptic, and the Semitic language family that Hebrew is a part of. In fact, you will even find Semitic languages spoken in Africa. The ancient Ethiopian language, Ge'ez, is a Semitic language, and is thus particularly close to Hebrew, even closer than Coptic, the Berber languages, and others in the family. Now, where did all these different languages originate? Well, that's an interesting question, and the answer is obviously... Yeah, pretty much that. Turns out there are no easy answers. Lots of scholars will tell you there are easy answers, with the easy confidence that comes to smart people who have spent their lives as the biggest fish in a relatively small pond. Some ancient linguists will tell you that there is strong evidence the Afro-Asiatic family began in Ethiopia, or Palestine, or Egypt, or North Africa, or Arabia. But the truth is, nobody really knows. And when they try to say that there's an easy, obvious answer, the reaction they get is, well, how did that go again? Afro-Asiatic languages are spoken all the way from the northwestern tip of Africa to the Fertile Crescent. Probably most scholars think it came from somewhere in the middle of that region, but that is about as firm as we can be. What we do know is that the members of this language family probably all originated from one group, and that group is very, very old. In fact, Afro-Asiatic is the oldest identified language family of them all. The mysterious originators of this family probably arose sometime between 18,000 and 8,000 BC, before deciding it was time to split off into smaller groups and start founding new languages. Which means that Israel and Africa were closely linked even before biblical times. Jews and Africans likely shared common linguistic and genetic ancestors. And they shared a number of distinctive customs, including circumcision. God may have commanded Abraham to circumcise himself, but there were other groups who did it without being told. Ancient Egyptians, Phoenicians, Syrians, and many other ethnic groups also had some practices of circumcision. Now, most of these groups stopped doing it over time. By the 1st century AD, Egyptians were making fun of Jews for circumcision. But millennia earlier, the practice had united Jews with many of their Middle Eastern and African neighbors. Now, given the experience of Jews in Egypt during the Exodus, you might think that Jews would be loath to leave their promised land and return to Egypt or the African lands beyond. You could not be more wrong. In fact, Jews were widely settled across the African continent by the time our story begins, including among the Berber peoples of North Africa. Jewish settlement among the Berbers dates back to the 3rd century BC. How did this happen? I have no idea. Actually, nobody has any idea how they got there. And in fact, it may go back even farther than that, according to one modern historian, my tour guide Ahmed. As part of my love affair with the tagine, I had the privilege of going to Morocco in 2024, and one day I hired a very friendly tour guide named Ahmed to show me the ancient city of Fez. Being a religion nerd, I made him show me the ancient Jewish synagogues and cemeteries in Morocco while we were there, and he told me that Jews had settled in Morocco all the way back in 5000 BC. 5000 BC! That's incredible! Unbelievable! Like, literally unbelievable. Like Abraham hadn't even been born yet, so how could there even be Jews? Did you just mean Semitic peoples were in Morocco then, Ahmed? Did you just tell me what you thought my religion nerd heart wanted to hear, Ahmed? Does the truth matter to you? I thought we had something, Ahmed. I thought we had something. In Simeon's Wake, now brought to you by Ben's Trust Issues. Have you been hurt? Yeah, we've all been hurt. Sometimes people aren't who they say they are. Sometimes we think that people will always have our best interests at heart, and they don't. When trust is damaged, it takes time and care for that to be restored. That's why it's so important to find a therapist that you can work with, who can sit and listen non-judgmentally. Except, yeah, that takes a lot of time and energy, so forget that. Yeah, just don't trust anybody again. One person was out to get you, that means the rest of them probably are too. Trust issues. Because if you're never vulnerable, you can't be hurt. In any case, we know that Jews settled among the Berber peoples at some point, definitely by the 3rd century BC. Maybe they initially settled in Egypt and moved further west as time went on. Maybe some of them joined up with Phoenician trading groups and spread out from Phoenician settlements. Maybe some of them just wanted cheap beachfront property or a mountain lodge in the Atlas region. Whatever the reason, they settled among the Berbers. They remained at least somewhat ethnically distinct. There are small genetic studies that show modern-day Berber Jews lack some of the gene expressions we typically see in North African folks. Their genes more closely resemble those of their Middle Eastern co-religionists. While we don't want to read too much into a small study, it does suggest that Jewish communities in Africa kept their genetic identity intact. But perhaps you are skeptical of this. Perhaps you are even harumphing in your chair or car seat or kitchen or wherever you listen to podcasts. I don't know your life. Perhaps you are thinking something like, but this is just preposterous, Ben. The Bible goes on and on about how special the land of Israel is. Why would a Jew just up and leave Israel and go and settle elsewhere, especially to live among Gentiles? Didn't the Jews think Gentiles were unclean, were lesser? And would they really work with Phoenicians, the Philistines, their sworn enemies? Who on earth would do such a thing? Well, those questions are understandable, but they all result from a lot of bad scholarship that has distorted our picture of ancient Judaism. First of all, the Bible does indeed say the land of Israel is special, but it never says that a Jew has to live in Israel. There were plenty of patriotic Jews who loved the land of Israel and chose to live elsewhere. Just like today, an American might be proud of their German or Italian or Irish or Mexican or Chinese heritage. They may regularly travel back to the motherland. It doesn't mean that they don't love America and their ancestral home. They love both. Second, Jews saw themselves as different from Gentiles, but not necessarily better than Gentiles. Nor were Jews forbidden from interacting with Gentiles. It would be impossible to trade otherwise. When the Bible says Gentiles are unclean, it usually means that they aren't allowed to go into the Jerusalem temple because they haven't performed the Jewish purity rites that would allow them to enter. Which makes sense because, they're not Jewish. So they're not going to perform the purity rites they need to do Jewish religious ceremonies. A Jew's only concern would be if they had participated in an activity with a Gentile that would require purification before going to the temple, or conducting a household rite that required some level of purity. And if you are living in Egypt or Carthage or Axum, you're probably not all that worried about whether you can go to the Jerusalem temple on the regular. And finally, as to the Jews would never work with Philistines theory, the Bible may have given you the wrong idea about that. First of all, the average Jew was not exactly horrified by the idea of other people worshiping different gods. In fact, many Jews worshipped different gods. We know they did. Why do we know they did that? Well, because if you read the Bible, you will find many, many passages in which prophets and priests yell at the people and tell them to stop worshiping other gods. As a rule, people don't yell at others to stop doing things that they aren't doing. So if people were yelling at the Israelites to stop worshiping other gods, the most probable conclusion is that's because they were worshiping other gods. And in fact, Old Testament prophets are most often yelling at the people to stop worshiping Ishtar, the Mesopotamian fertility goddess, and Baal, the storm god worshipped by the Philistines, whose veneration they spread across the sea. Now, most of these Jews probably saw no contradiction in their worship. They loved all the gods. Yahweh was great, so was Ishtar, so was Baal. They worshipped all of them, either unaware of or choosing to ignore the fact that Yahweh is not a sharing kind of deity. For many Jews, living among a foreign nation and adapting to their worship was no big deal. The divide between ancient Israelites in those days was not so much between monotheists and polytheists, as between polytheists and henotheists. Essentially, a henotheist is somebody who believes in the existence of multiple deities but only worships one of them, whereas a polytheist will worship a lot of them. Even the most hardcore religious types in the ancient Jewish world were henotheists. They believed that beings like Baal and Ishtar existed. Maybe they thought they were lesser beings, sort of angels, or just lesser deities, but they thought Yahweh was the only God Israel was supposed to worship. Your average Jew around the corner, though, might well have thought that there was no harm in placating all of the powerful spiritual beings around them. But even if you were one of those super religious, super devout Jews exclusively devoted to the worship of Yahweh, you could live among the polytheists. We know this is true because the Bible tells us about one Jew who did just that, King David. You'll find this story in 1 Samuel chapter 27. At the time, David was on the run from King Saul, and he had to settle among the Philistines for about 16 months. He even became a commander in the Philistine army. Now, the Bible doesn't say that David liked this arrangement, and David went out of his way to avoid fighting Israelites, but he did what he needed to do to survive. People everywhere, at all times and in all places, have done the same. Whether it was for a better life, or a change of scenery, or just to escape hostility, Jews left the land of Israel and settled elsewhere. It was particularly easy to do so after Alexander the Great had conquered most of the known world, bringing trade relations and a unifying Hellenistic culture with him. Throughout the Berber kingdoms, Jews lived and prospered. In fact, many of them lived in modern-day Libya, where tradition says that the Apostle Mark grew up. They worked as traders, craftsmen, farmers, soldiers, and any other jobs they could. And the Jews would live among the Berbers all the way down to almost the present day. Most Jews remained in the area until the 1950s, after the Arab-Israeli War. Tensions grew between Jews and Muslims in the area, and virtually all Jews chose to leave. The Jewish population of Morocco, once a hotbed of Jewish culture, now numbers about 2,200 individuals, who almost exclusively live in the capital city of Casablanca. Now, not all Jews went as far west as the Berber lands. Some of them chose to settle in a land a bit closer to home, the land of Egypt. There were several prominent Jewish settlements in Egypt. One of the oldest was at Elephantine, which was a fortress on the border of Egypt and Nubia. It probably got its name because it was the place from which Egypt got its war elephants from Nubia. So the fortress was home to a large community of Jewish mercenaries who worked for the pharaoh, and who probably got to pet elephants all day. Now, why would strapping Jewish boys go off to fight for a foreign king? Well, money, probably. Mercenary work could pay well, and the super wealthy pharaoh could pay better and offer more consistent employment than the eternally put upon king of Judah. But I think the most likely reason of all is that the Jewish soldiers knew that if they went to Elephantine, they could befriend lots and lots of elephants. Maybe they could even live out a J.R.R. Tolkien fantasy and be like the men of the East who rode their war elephants into battle. Elephantine's Jewish population was large, so large in fact that they had their own temple devoted to Yahweh, possibly the largest temple outside of the one in Jerusalem. The temple stood for quite some time, but it was destroyed in a riot by Egyptian priests who followed the traditional gods. Now, although the temple was rebuilt, it was abandoned around 400 BC. It's proof that even when Jews were in a big community, they were not safe from anti-Semitic prejudice. By the way, the existence of a temple outside of the Jerusalem temple is one of the more interesting bits of archaeological evidence we have to compare to the Bible. Because if you read books like, say, Deuteronomy, it's very, very clear in the book of Deuteronomy that there is only ever supposed to be one temple. God has chosen Jerusalem as the place where the temple is going to be and the place where God wants to be worshipped. We know that that was not always the way things were done. The northern kingdom of Israel appears to have had its own center of religious worship. And in fact, in John chapter 4, when Jesus meets the Samaritan woman, you may remember that she asks Jesus, hey, how come our ancestors worship God on this mountain and you worship God in the Jerusalem temple? What's up with that and who's right? Well, it wasn't just a northern and southern Israel thing. It was also whether you lived in Israel at all or not. So the Egyptian Jews in Elephantine had their own temple. Now, what was going on here, we don't exactly know. One common theory, promulgated by a lot of Old Testament scholars, is that God's commandment to only worship in Jerusalem was a much later addition to Israelite religion. In fact, a lot of people trace it to right around 500 BC, which kind of fits with the Elephantine temple being abandoned in 400 BC. Basically, this new idea takes about a century to make its way down the Nile there. That's one theory. Another theory might be that the Jewish population understood the Jerusalem temple was the main spot, but that was so much of a commute that they figured God would be all right if they had a more local shrine that they could offer sacrifices at. In either case, the Jews in Elephantine worshipped at their temple and faced all the prejudices that came from being strangers in a strange land. However, the Jewish soldiers would have a chance to avenge themselves on their persecutors a few generations later, when Alexander the Great came to town. Now, Alexander the Great is a whole situation. We don't have time to go into his life story, but here is the short version. Alexander was the son of King Philip of Macedon. Macedon was a small kingdom that sat just north of the ancient Greek city-states. Philip saw Alexander's prodigious gifts at a young age and ensured that he got the very best tutors money could buy. And when I say the best, I mean the best. As in Aristotle, of Taught by Plato, brilliant philosopher, still read in philosophy classes today fame. Aristotle and Alexander had a long and fruitful relationship even after the king was grown. At least until the end of his life, when the two had a falling out. The falling out was either due to philosophical differences, like how to govern a city and what the definition of bravery was, or because Aristotle's nephew maybe kind of sort of tried to poison Alexander. The latter explanation is a lot cooler, but it's also mentioned in only one ancient source, and that ancient source also says the poison could only be stored in a donkey's hoof for some reason, so take it with a grain of salt. The philosophical differences are more likely, but also more boring, so think what you'd like. Anyway, Alexander inherited his father's kingdom at the age of 20 and began to immediately conquer everything everywhere. He had ambitions of expanding, and he expanded to Egypt, Asia Minor, Persia, India. Nothing was off limits for Alexander. He even expanded horizons in the most dangerous frontier of all, men's fashion. You see, there was a specific look for emperors in Alexander's day. Short hair on top, or bald, and a big, bushy beard. Alexander inverted that. He had luscious, thick, curly locks of hair, and was clean-shaven. Now, that probably had something to do with the fact that the average emperor was a man in his 40s or 50s, whereas Alexander had conquered whole countries before a modern person would have even finished college. Or maybe Alexander just couldn't grow a beard and had to show his virility on top of his head. Either way, Alexander was determined to make fetch happen. And he did. He became the peak of fashion in his empire and helped spark a renaissance of clean-shaven rulers and elites throughout the empire. He did all this while being, in the terms of Gen Z, a short king. Alexander was about 5 feet tall, which is very short for a man by today's standards, but only a little bit shorter than the average man of his day. From Napoleon to Alexander, a short king could check off a very tall to-do list. In Simeon's Wake is now brought to you by Short Men's Fashion. Short kings, you've got a lot on your plate. Ordinary isn't enough for you. No, you demand the tailor-made, the sophisticated, the exceptional. You need fashion that can look good in the boardroom and that won't slow you down on the battlefield where you're dodging arrows and strikes from all of the many, many, many soldiers who are trying to stop you from conquering the world. Men's fashion for the short, sophisticated conqueror. Alexander also expanded the horizons of partying, because he partied a lot. Massive feasts and drinking contests were the order of the day in his army. He had about as many lovers as you'd expect a world-conquering emperor cum fashion icon to have, and he enjoyed the company of men and women. His partying habits may have contributed to his death at age 32. After a long night of drinking with a new ally, Alexander began to fall ill. He experienced terrible episodic fevers that worsened until he was unable to speak, and he died after 12 days of illness. Either he was poisoned, a theory that was popular in the ancient world but is less endorsed today, or he contracted an illness, possibly malaria, and his binge drinking habits didn't give his body a great chance of fighting it off. Either way, Alexander shuffled off his mortal coil before reaching a third of a century. A blazing testimony to just how much the right person can do with drive, ambition, talent, and a massive army and treasury behind him. Before his death, one of Alexander's big conquests was Egypt, as you know from previous episodes. When he came to Egypt, Jewish mercenaries fought alongside him and gained his favor. Alexander rewarded his allies with enormous levels of religious tolerance and freedom. Jews were given protected status and could settle freely among the population. Now, Jews generally chose to live together, creating Jewish quarters in many of their cities to more easily maintain their customs and defend themselves against their neighbors' prejudices. Nowhere was this more famously done than in Alexandria, where 2 whole sections of the city were designated for their use. They had their own leaders and judicial system, in addition to serving in governance roles for the whole city. By Roman times, Jews made up as much as 35% of Alexandria's entire population, and Alexandrian Jews had envoys throughout the entire Jewish world. There were representatives of Alexandrian Jews in Jerusalem, for instance. During this period, there were probably about 1 million Jews in Egypt altogether, and 100,000 of them lived in Alexandria. By population, it was the largest concentration of Jews anywhere in the world. But that did not mean all was well for the Jews of Alexandria. Native Egyptians resented their high status and alliance with the ruling powers, first the Greek-speaking Ptolemies, and then the Roman officials afterwards. One of the first pogroms known to history occurred in Alexandria in 38 AD. While the authorities intervened to stop it, the damage was done. Nor did the Romans defend their Jewish citizens fully. In fact, they imposed a tax on Jews in response, presumably to compensate their soldiers for the trouble of defending them. Nevertheless, the Jewish community in Alexandria persisted, and their interactions with the Christians of the city would prove highly significant for both groups. Once the Jews had been slaves in Egypt, their descendants, like their ancestor Joseph, spent centuries as scholars, craftsmen, and even rulers in the very same nation. I said that this podcast would focus on 3 geographical areas: North Africa, Egypt, and Ethiopia. We've talked about North Africa, we've talked about Egypt. I'll let you guess who's coming next. We know a lot less about the early history of Ethiopian Jews than we do of Jews in the rest of Africa. Some of this is just because we have fewer primary sources in English to work with than in the case of the Roman Empire. But we do know that there were Jews in Ethiopia from very early on. Some of the evidence is the similarity of Ge'ez and Hebrew, which are both Semitic languages. Ethiopia's proximity to the Arabian Peninsula opened it to influence from Semitic peoples, including Jews who immigrated there for the same reasons as they immigrated to many other nations. There is also one very prominent Ethiopian Jew from the 1st century, Simeon Bakos himself. Acts chapter 8, verse 27 tells us that Simeon was not out for a joyride in the Judean wilderness. It says he had come to Jerusalem to worship. In other words, he intended to visit the Jerusalem temple. Now, you should know that there is significant debate among scholars about Simeon's exact position vis-a-vis Judaism. On the one hand, he has a lot of traits one would expect to find in an observant Jew. He has a copy of the Book of Isaiah, which is not exactly a vanity purchase. Books in antiquity were rare and valuable. People only bought them if they believed them to be terribly important. He had also journeyed all the way from his royal court to Jerusalem to worship, which is not exactly an easy trip. All that suggests that the eunuch was quite interested in Israel's God. There are questions about whether he was a Jew fulfilling his obligation to worship at Jerusalem, or a Gentile in the process of converting, or a God-fearer, which is a Gentile who had no interest in becoming a Jew, but worshipped Israel's God. So it was a little misleading of me to call him a Jew. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. The boundaries in the ancient world are kind of fluid on those things. Sorry about that, but hey, this is a long episode, and I thought you needed a hook to keep you interested, so here we are. I should also point out that even if Simeon Bakos was a Gentile who had heard of Israel's God, one must still ask the question of how he heard of Israel's God. There were communities of Jews in Ethiopia. That's the only way he would have learned about it. And that's the really important thing. Biblical evidence establishes Jews in Ethiopia in the 1st century AD, and if a court official is taking notice of them, they've probably been around for a while. Later in Ethiopia's history, its Jews will organize into a group known as the Beta Israel, or House of Israel. This organization happens in the 4th century AD, and we'll cover it more when we get there. For now, you just need to know about the group and its understanding of its origins. The Beta Israel claims to have been descended from the tribe of Dan and immigrated to Ethiopia in ancient times. No word on the tribal relations with Alpha Israel or Sigma Israel. Depending on the story, you might hear them say that Moses' children led their migration to Ethiopia. Now, it would be a little odd for the Israelites, who were at the time headed toward Canaan, to split off with some folks convinced that the real promised land was way in the south. So there are other versions of the story that say the tribe came to Ethiopia by way of Egypt after the kingdom of Israel split into its northern and southern kingdoms. Now, as with so many things in ancient history, we can't prove the truth of any version of that story. There's absolutely no evidence that has survived either way. However, we do know that there are some uncanny parallels between the Judaism of Ethiopia and that of Israel. Sometime around the 9th century, a Jew named Eldad of Dan visited Jewish communities in Egypt, Mauritania, and beyond. Eldad recorded his adventures, which would put Gulliver to shame. He was on a boat that got wrecked and encountered a tribe of cannibals who ate his travel buddy, but was rescued when another African Jew bought him as a slave from the tribe. But more important for our purposes is Eldad's Jewish identity. He spoke a dialect of Hebrew that sounded odd to Egyptian Jews, but they recognized it as a form of Hebrew. Some of the rabbis questioned him on matters of the law, and they found his views generally legit, sort of within the ballpark of what you could expect. He had interpretations that were different from theirs, and at first they thought he was a Karaite. That's another term for the people the Bible calls Samaritans. But then the rabbis realized that his views didn't exactly match that sect either. There are other medieval accounts of Ethiopian Jews that match this general pattern. They're quite similar to their northern cousins, but with just enough differences to suggest that they represent a different stream of Judaism. Scholarly consensus has pinpointed the moment of Jewish migration to Ethiopia as long as your pinpoint is 2 millennia wide. Some suggest a very ancient date. Others notice similarities to things that Second Temple Jews were doing up in Israel and think Ethiopian Jews migrated around the 1st century. Others think it happened as late as the 16th century. Nobody really knows what was going on there, and unfortunately we won't get much light shed on that question until the 300s AD, because that is when our primary sources begin to appear. But that is all right. For now, we will turn our attention to one Jew in particular. At the dawn of the 1st century AD, one child would be born who would reshape the course of Judaism as we know it. He was a brilliant visionary who offered a sweeping interpretation of all Jewish history, a history which some of his contemporaries might say pointed straight to him. He was a daring teacher whose interpretations of the law of Moses confounded those around him, and got him labeled as a renegade by more conservative members. He tangled with Roman leaders and amassed a group of disciples around himself. And for better or for worse, Judaism and Christianity have never been the same. That's right. Next time, we're going to be talking about Philo of Alexandria. Oh, what's that? Oh, you thought you were going to be talking about Jesus? Ha, no, silly. This is a podcast about Africa. Jesus wasn't born in Africa. But if you were a bit misled, it's understandable. The parallels between Philo and Jesus are striking. They were also contemporaries of each other, although they never met. The Gospels will tell you about Jesus, but perhaps you haven't heard as much about this Alexandrine titan of the faith. So let me fill that gap in next time, because all of us, even Simeon, understand the scriptures in Philo's wake.
Thank you for listening to In Simeon's Wake, part of the Earth and Altar Podcast Network. If you liked the episode, please leave it a review and drop a like on that episode at your earliest convenience, or even before. It's nice. If you'd like to support this work, head on over to patreon.com/Ben Wyatt. That's patreon.com/Ben Wyatt, WYATT. Until next time, stay curious.